Emil Hammar from IT University Copenhagen.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
Hello everyone, I'm Emil Hammar from ITU, as Rune just told you. I'm currently writing my master's thesis on something that's not related to this particular topic. It's about minority representation in digital games, so if you're interested in talking about that, just come talk to me afterwards. Nevertheless, what I'm going to present today is more of a preliminary or initial work I did last semester along with Miguel Sicard, in which I kind of tentatively propose or suggest a way to look at digital games through the work of particularly Don Eides' Postphenomenological concepts, as well as Gadamer's notion of play. So, for my presentation, I'll start by delineating and outlining Eides' technological mediations and apply it to digital games and see whether or not that particular concept works. And since I'm applying these concepts in the domain of digital games, I'm gonna cite or at least refer to Gadamer in terms of establishing a proper notion of play. Through this establishment of play, I will have to return to my hermeneutic relation to see how the model or concept works afterwards. Subsequently, I'll notice or highlight some of the analytical implications of such an establishment and point towards further research or directions if anybody is interested in that particular thing. And finally, of course, the Christensen discussion. So primarily view this mostly as kind of a suggestion or appetizer in terms of how to view digital games. So basically, Ide he suggests there's different ways that we experience the world through technologies, and he posits or proposes 4 different types of relations. However, due to the scope of the paper that I submitted, I will only concern myself with one of these relations, which is namely the hermeneutical or hermeneutic relation. The hermeneutic relation is defined as, is described or characterized where we perceive the world through a particular technology, such as, for example, if we look at a thermometer, or in the example of an ultrasound scan of a fetus, we perceive the world through the technology itself. In the phrasing of Introna, he defines this as technologies which functions as an immediate reference to something beyond itself. So, in the case of the ultrasound scan of the fetus, the image itself refers to the world or the reality of the fetus inside. If we apply this particular hermeneutic relation to digital games, I tentatively at least propose this model of viewing it as a player who perceives the virtual or interprets and perceives the virtual environment through the digital game as technology. And in doing so, it allows me to highlight at least how the design and implementation of digital games as technology allows us to analyze the ways in which it discloses or presents something to us in terms of how to understand the world. There's this particular quote from Bergen, who talks about how many forms of technological mediation are possible that transform our access to the world in myriad ways, some of which open us to new ways of access unavailable to naked eye perception, and some of which narrow this access. And if we refer this to digital games in the example of Dysphoria by Anthropy, 2012, it allows us, at least in some regards, to perceive the game as technology, how it not only depicts and conveys its virtual world and through its 2D graphics and so on, but it also allows us to see how this particular virtual environment discloses what it means to, for example, be transgendered. Thus, I define, or at least characterize, the hermeneutic relation that is able to somewhat at least characterize the nature in which digital games as technology hermeneutically mediate their virtual environment to the player. I'll return later to what Ida also, or at least in my paper you can refer to, I talk about how Ida also mentions computer games, or rather digital games, in terms of what kind of mediation that is occurring. However, one thing we have to keep in mind when we analyze digital games, at least in my argument, is that we have to take into account the notion of play, because whereas perceiving or interpreting the ultrasound image or scan of a fetus, when we engage technologies such as digital games, we play with them. And there's something characteristic about play, I would argue at least, in terms of how we engage with them. And for this I employ, or at least refer to, Gadamer's notion of play. And in short, he basically defines play, or characterizes play, as a constant dialectic to and fro movement between player and game. So the game not only conveys a certain type of meaning that needs to be interpreted, but in turn the player alters or renews this particular experience or interpretation through the act of play. And particularly these two that I just mentioned, these two particular characteristics, are especially relevant for this proposal of hermeneutic relation applied to at least digital games, due to the fact that in play we configure or renew our experience, at least according to Gadamer's notion of play. So in that regard, the new formalized version of my prior concept looks as follows, in which the player not only the player not only uses the technology itself and is exposed to it, but also that the technology uses him or her. In terms of kind of implications for using or applying such a model to digital games, my argument at least is that it accounts for, or allows us to analyze the social and ethical aspects of how digital games in virtual environments are defined. And moreover, as Verbeek also states, that a hermeneutic technology, after all, provides a representation of reality, which implies that the design of such a technology predetermines which aspect of reality is to be made perceptible by it, and in which ways. And in that regard, you should probably notice that Verbeek talks about which aspect of reality, which of course he is might not be applicable in terms of digital games, as they are not always depicting reality, but maybe, or rather, a virtual or fictional world. So finally, my argument, at least, or proposition, is that this kind of approach highlights the status of the depicted virtual environment in a digital game, thus pointing towards further inquiry into the relationship between enacted experiences within a virtual environment and the status of virtual actions and the virtual world's disclosure or lack thereof of reality. And in terms of future directions, if anyone were interested in doing so, you could look into at least especially the other types of technological mediations, such as the embodied, the alterity relation, or the background relation. It is of particular note that Ide himself claims that digital games are a form of alterity relation, but that is further outlined and argued in my paper, which you can refer to. So we can also potentially or possibly research into further aspects on how games are designed to represent a virtual environment and how this kind of representation is conveyed, as well as how in the dialectic nature of play representations are altered in the playing of them. So in summary, to sum up my presentation, Edith's hermeneutical relation gives insight to how digital games and virtual environments operate as technologies in their representation of their virtual environment. And in turn, and keeping in mind, of course, is the concept of how play as a dialectic process helps account for how players engage games. And therefore, this tentatively proposed concept points towards further understanding of digital games as technologies and the design and playing of them. And thank you for your time and attention. I'm sorry it was kind of short, but so you can refer to my paper for further analysis. And that's it.
Thank you, Emil.
Yeah.
Questions? Ollie.
Thank you for an interesting paper.
Thanks.
I would like to know more about the idea of computer games as appearing in hermeneutic relations. Especially given that ID himself says that they appear in alternative relations. And I see what you are doing there. You are separating between the technology and the virtual environment. And I would like to, if you were to drop this model into reality, imagine it as a cookie cutter sheet and you drop it down into the world. So what is in the box that says technology, that which does the mediation? And what is in the other box that says virtual environment, that to which the experience terminates?
I mean,
so how to distinguish between the technology and the environment?
Yeah. So in regard to this particular model, at least, I would argue that the technology could be viewed as kind of the properties, or maybe a more holistic assessment of the entire digital game in question. I mean, as is, or what do you, if you can say that kind of thing. Whereas the virtual environment itself is kind of the fictional and virtual representation as another possible world, presumably. And throughout this, at least my proposition or suggestion of this model, it also highlights to me whether or not the virtual environment should be understood as this kind of possible fictional or virtual world, but also as what kind of aspect of reality is disclosed in this particular virtual environment. And this is a distinction that I haven't been able to make, at least so far, as this is only a preliminary work. Yeah.
Hermeneutic relations together with embodied relations belong to the category of relations of mediation. And the idea was that the experience goes through the technology into the world. And if that in which the experience terminates in this case is a fictional world or a possible world, we can't say that the experience terminates in the world. Like the experience of using a telephone terminates in the world very specifically when somebody picks up the receiver at the other end. Another thing, more like a question again, is like how about these things where the interface and the diegetic world merge? Like the HEV suit in Half-Life, where you don't have any interface until you put on the suit. Or these transparent interfaces, like Ubisoft's King Kong, where there is no health bar, but it is communicated via the diegetic functions, like Avatar is breathing heavily when taking damage. Then we could say that normally there is the interface. That concession we might make. But in these cases, we can't even speak of the sort of overlay interface as a technology.
Yeah, at least I completely see how at least at that particular example would at least entail that I had to make a distinction between exactly the technology and the diegetic or fictional representation. But yeah, I'll definitely take that into note, and that's plausible argument at least. So thanks.
So
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I was also kind of wondering, following on from what Oli just asked. Derrida has this concept of originary technicity, where he talks about, there's a difference between the prosthetic and, if you put on a pacemaker and your heart beats, and that it's looked on as a prosthesis, but Derrida says it's originary prostheticity, because it's kind of almost, it informs what you are yourself, your you-ness or whatever it is. So is that kind of a separate, can you really separate technology from the way you do anything at all? From the way you are. So that's my question. Are you kind of able to bring that, the
separation?
Separation at all? Is it not kind of in the origin itself?
Yeah, I think. At least in terms of how to establish this model, you would have to make that kind of distinction. But if we look at, for example, this particular ultrasound scan of a fetus, one could probably argue, or not argue, but at least pinpoint whether or not how much this particular representation of reality is affected by the technology in question. And it's not that there's such a large distinction, but perhaps Ollie knows better than me in terms of Ida's work. But at least that's, I think the model is more of a suggestive way to talk about how technology mediates the world as such. So I think the more ontological or epistemological discussion is an automatic consequence of applying the model. But I'm unfortunately unsure to propose. Yeah. Yeah.
No, just maybe a stupid question, but I was just wondering, when you say that the virtual world kind of offers representations that the player interacts with phenomenologically, but in a certain sense, do you also speak of mental representations as well on the part of the player, that they produce? They are kind of, let's say, simulations of a fictional world, representations as a simulation, whereas the player itself, a player itself will always construct the game on the basis of their own past experience, etc., etc. So, but do you kind of go into that? I don't know even if that's very coherent with Ida's method either. But anyway,
I think that's a fine question, and it highlights or points at least towards the reason, or at least some of the motivation of why I'm applying Gadamer, because by using this particular notion of play, it enables me exactly, at least to account for how players, when interacting with games, digital games rather, reinterprets or reconfigures the game itself, and so kind of like this model. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to ask a very kind of general question myself. Quite often you hear technology conceptualized as, in one way or another, there are many versions of this, but the notion of augmentation, the technology augments us. How does this approach relate to that, would you?
Well, I think at least Ollie is maybe more qualified to answer that question, but I think, we have seen instances of where the postphenomenological concepts of how technology mediates something has been applied to exactly robotic or augmentative technologies. I'm personally unsure how the particular
Yeah, or for example, the notion of the McLuhan's thing with the notion of extensions, the technology as extensions.
The particular, I didn't characterize or define that relation, but the embodied one that Edith proposes accounts for how technologies functions as extensions of us. So, for example, my glasses, in some ways, help me see better and extends my eyesight in some ways. But that's another concept that's not been delineated.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And